Matthew 25 is a vision of the Presbyterian Church PCA as Jesus calls us to serve with and for all of our siblings because they are all people who are deeply loved by Jesus. One part of this mission is to dismantle structural racism by fearlessly applying our faith to advocate and break down the systems, practices, and thinking that underlie discrimination, bias, prejudice, and oppression of people of color. Here at Everybody's Church, our Matthew 25 work group worked for nearly a year studying what the church and leading experts have to say about structural racism. One thing that we learned is that we cannot just volunteer for a weekend and be done. That we must first learn from the experts, like we have here tonight, and take this message to heart before we can affect real change. So after tonight, we invite you to go back to our Matthew 25 website to the Learn tab. There we have a short curated list of books, videos, podcasts, websites for you to explore on this topic and the other topics that have been in our series. So you can look at any of those if you choose. We now have limited physical copies of the books that are recommended on the website. They're sitting on the shelf in front of the Calvin Hall for you to just check out. 2 weeks from now, on March 3rd, we will hold a lean-in small group discussion session, where we can virtually come together to reflect on what we've learned and what we wish to change about how we act as a person, a church, and a community. Please sign up for these sessions via the Lean In tab if you wish to be a part of this conversation. From the Lean In discussions, that we are compiling a list of projects that our church will embark on in the years to come. So, and now a bit about our speakers that we have on. Regina Cannon will be our first speaker tonight. She serves as the Chief Equity and Impact Officer and Vice President of Housing Solutions at C4 Innovations, and as the Director of the National Initiative, READY Initiative, which is Racial Equity Design and Implementation. She has dedicated her career to being a vocal, active leader fighting for equitable policies, systems, and institutions, and addressing the marginalization of people of color. She has more than 20 years of experience leading anti-poverty initiatives, addressing homelessness, supportive housing, criminal justice reform, community capacity building, and youth leadership development. Regina leads teams at C4 Innovations and for HUD to embed racial equity principles in funding guidelines, housing policies, practices, and services. Regina and her teams also work one-on-one with organizations and community coalitions across the country to develop strategic goals centered in equity and accountability policies to ensure those goals are met. She delivers keynotes and racial equity workshops in communities across the country and is the host of the mini podcast, Morning Cup of Equity. And then Kimber is Kimber Bishop-Yanke. She'll be our second speaker tonight. She is the chair of the Oakland County Task Force on Poverty and Homelessness and is the founder of the nonprofit Kids Empowered on the Move. As chair of the task force, she has spent the last 2 years working on increasing awareness to community members and elected leaders about the barriers that people in poverty and homelessness face. Since the pandemic started, Kimber has organized over 600 volunteers to engage in supporting 200 families in need through weekly food deliveries, clothing, furniture, adopt a family for Christmas and Easter, and helping families connect to services, as well as raise money to pay for bills and mobile homes for families. She also raises funds and obtains services, including finding housing for homeless families that are not able to obtain help from existing organizations. Kimber is also the owner of Kids Empowered. So with that, Regina, would you start us off, please?
Thank you so much. I'd be glad to. I'm going to share my screen and get it started. I'll ask, can everyone, if someone can give me a thumbs up that you can see it. Okay, let's go. Perfect, thank you. Well, it is fantastic to be with you tonight. Thank you so much for the invitation. Many of you all may know this is my life work. This is my passion. So I am glad to be here to share with you some of the things that we have been doing over the last couple of years on the national level, And then, of course, Kimber will talk about some things at the local level, okay? And so a few things that I'd like to discuss with you tonight, some discussion points. So why should we be focusing on race and racism when we're talking about housing and housing instability? Like, how does all of that come into play? So we'll be looking at some national statistics, looking at the disproportionality in bridge systems or adjacent systems. And then we'll talk about the historical context and the impact of structural racism on housing and homelessness. And then we'll talk about a current racial equity work in homelessness and see what does it mean to reimagine this system of services and housing through a racial equity lens and with the folks that are most impacted. So let's get started. Why focus on race? So here's the thing, we've got to make sure that we're bringing the folks that are most impacted into the work of ending homelessness, right? And we know through our numbers, through our statistics, that those folks are disproportionately Black and brown folks, okay? The numbers tell us this. Take just a moment to look at these numbers. Even though Black folks are about 12.5% of the general population, about 24% of deep poverty, they represent almost 43% of those experiencing homelessness. And then look at the disproportionality of American Indians and Alaska Natives. So even though the numbers are small, they're 4 times as likely to experience homelessness. And when you look at Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, 9 times as likely to experience homelessness. So the numbers take us there. We can't deny race and ethnicity. And this is here, right here in your county. Take a look at that. The blue line represents the white population of those experiencing homelessness, and that orange line represents the Black population experiencing homelessness. Look what we're showing here. 76% of folks in the county are white. About 64% are experiencing deep poverty. 42% experiencing homelessness. Now let's be clear here, we don't want anyone to experience homelessness, okay? But we see that kind of inverse. Like that's what you would expect to see. Like lesser people experiencing poverty, and then lesser folks that are experiencing homelessness. But it is the exact inverse when you're talking about the Black folks here in your county. 14% in the general population, 24% experiencing deep poverty, but 51% experiencing homelessness. Think about that. That's over 3 times, almost 4 times as many folks experiencing homelessness than in the general population, okay? And then homelessness in Native Americans. About 1 in 200 people who identify as American Indian and Alaska Native as their only race are homeless. Think of that, compared with 1 in 1,000 people in US population overall. Look at that disparity, 1 in 200. And so the numbers pull us to race. So it's not just this arbitrary thing that, gosh, we'd like to make something else, yet about race and the impact of structural racism, okay? Why we lead with race? Race is the leading predictor of every given social inequity, every single one. Criminal justice system, the outcomes, social inequity. Environmental health, educational outcomes, health outcomes, economic outcomes, and of course, housing outcomes. So every single system, there's not one system in these United States that is untouched by structural racism leading to an equitable outcome for Black folks and other folks of color. Let that sink in for a moment. Every single system. Okay? And so tonight I want to talk to you about why we need to start moving to equity and not be so focused on equality when we talk about dismantling structural racism. And so here's the difference. When we talk about equality, right, that's about sameness. That's about saying everybody gets the same thing. Doesn't matter what you need. We're just going to give everybody the same thing. Here's the problem with that, is that everybody's not in the same situation. Everybody's not experiencing the same conditions. So why would we give everyone the same thing? And I know that concept can be so hard to wrap our heads around, because from the time that we could grow up, the time that we went to school, we were always taught to focus on equality. And let's be clear, that will always be our North Star, always, right? But to get to equality for all, we've got to get to equity for all, because the equality in this moment is simply not enough. What equity does, equity recognizes that people are situated differently with different circumstances and needs. The equality is just going to treat everybody the same, you know? But equity says, I'm going to give everybody what's fair. Equity ensures that everyone has the supports and the resources necessary to be successful, using targeted strategies that address root causes. Because see, if we just keep giving the same people the same stuff over and over again, we will never get to a place of ending homelessness or eliminating or reducing all of the other inequities that structural racism produces. And here's the thing, here's the kicker, and I want you to listen to this. Equity and racial justice benefits everyone. Let me say that again. Equity benefits everyone. So this is not just about Black folks, you know, other folks of color. Equity in every system makes everyone's life better. Because here's the deal, there is a cost, structural racism for everyone, okay? Let's remember that when we begin to think about, well, my gosh, this is, you know, we're doing this because we just sort of want to help people, or this is a handout here, that we cannot approach homelessness or dealing with the inequities of every system as charity. We must approach it as justice, right? And so that whole big thing that we always talk about, justice for all, we really mean it, but it goes through equity, okay? Why do we need this? Here are just illustrations. You see, people start from different places, right? And so we want to give people what they need. In this instance, we're talking about individuals. And so someone who's starting from a different place, they may not need the one box or the two boxes. And of course, we're speaking metaphorically here. We need to give people what they need. So that's looking at an individual level, right? If we look at a community level, it's the same thing. Say, for instance, we got lucky enough, you know, some county, say your county, and someone said, you know what, I've got $1 billion that I'm going to give this county, but it can only go to 2 neighborhoods, okay? And we're going to just randomly pull these 2 neighborhoods, see? And so the 2 neighborhoods that we pull, we look at the demographics of those neighborhoods, we look at the economics of those neighborhoods, and we see that one of those neighborhoods has a really, really wonderful, you know, income level there. They've got all of these magnificent resources. You know, everyone's doing really well. Their health outcomes are great. You know, kids are thriving. And we look at the other neighborhood, and it's not so great, right? It's been underinvested in, right? There's not a lot of deeply affordable housing that's quality affordable housing. And so we don't need to split that $1 billion in half. Because see, that would be equality. That means that we're just been giving the folks that already have, the community that already has a lot going on for it, we're going to be giving them even more. What we need to do is make sure that community that has been underinvested in, that they're getting what they need. And if that means that they get $700, $800, million, so be it, because that's equity. I'm just going to pause there. Let that sink in, because that's hard. That's a hard concept, to go from thinking about things as equality to thinking about equity. But see, that's part of dismantling all of these kinds of structures that racism has wrought over these many centuries. Okay? So how did we get here? One of the things that we like to do is to make sure that we never just sort of throw out numbers and all of these really awful statistics and everything without putting them in context. So we're going to take a little walk down history's lane today and say how we got here. How did we get to this place of all of these housing inequities and inequities in other systems as well? But tonight we're going to focus on housing inequities, okay? Richard Rothstein had a wonderful quote. He said that only if we can develop a broadly shared understanding of our common history will it be practical to consider steps we could take to fulfill our obligation? Okay, so we need to understand our history, put things in context. So we want to understand the intersection of racism and housing in the United States. This is a housing segregation timeline, and this one happens to start at 1866, right? The Civil Rights Act mandates that all persons born in the United States except indigenous people, the people whose land was taken, right, are citizens and are granted the full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property. But then in 1883, we had civil rights cases. And let me read to you what happened. The Supreme Court decided to exclude from the housing market. They said that if you were excluding housing from some folks, that remember, this is not a badge or an incident of slavery, and that the federal government cannot prohibit public discrimination by individuals or organizations. Let me read that to you again. The Supreme Court decided that exclusion from the housing market is not an incident of slavery. Oh my, slavery's ended. It's been, 20 years now? They should have gotten it all together. And that the federal government cannot prohibit public discrimination by individuals and organizations. So of course, how are you going to enter into the housing market if you were just coming out of slavery, right? And then fast forward. Plessy versus Ferguson. Supreme Court approves racial segregation and public accommodations where separate but equal facilities existed for African Americans. Separate but equal, right? Doesn't work, right? And so you keep going through all of these different things. These are codified, right? Supreme courts across the country upheld these kinds of acts, right? All the way through redlining, all the way through the long segregation. So let's talk about some of those specifically, okay? Go all the way back, right? Calling it still the ancestral homelands from Native people, as though that weren't considered mass homelessness, right? 1619, the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, uprooting people from their homes and their homeland to bring them over so that they would be homeless, right? Fast forward to the 1700s through 1863. In 1734, New York started recording some of the first poorhouses, where you're just literally warehousing people, throwing them all together, right? In 1820, you have the Industrial Revolution. So people are also, again, uprooted through the Industrial Revolution. People coming in and just trying to find a room or somewhere to live, and so many of them uprooted, sleeping out under tents, out in the streets, right? Fast forward to 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. So now we say, oh, well, wait, we're going to set all of the slaves free. Okay, but then what? Then what, right? Then we have all of these Civil Rights Act, the challenges to the Civil Rights Act that said, well, wait a minute, yeah, we set you free, but we're not going to let you do anything. We're not going to let you buy any land. We're going to make sure that you don't have any housing. So in other words, we're going to continue this form of slavery just by another name. Yeah. And so there was this radical policy, though. Right after the Civil War, during the first part of Reconstruction, you all have heard the saying, 40 acres and a mule. That was real. That was real. See, these 20 Black preachers, they met with all of these folks from the military and the government, and they said to them, they asked these Black preachers, they said, what do you need? And they said, if you'll just give every family 40 acres and a mule, we'll take care of the rest. We know how to work. We've been working for hundreds of years. We got this. But guess what? They only started to do that. Only a very few households received their 40 acres. None of them actually got to the mule. And a couple of years later, when Andrew Johnson came into it, he yanked it all back. He said, not under my watch. Not under my watch. They will have nothing. And it was all taken away. Yeah. But a radical idea, right? 40 acres and a mule. Just let us work. And so keep going, keep going. 1896 through the 1970s, the United States and the Jim Crow era, right? Well, the prohibitions against living in certain places, yeah? And so not only were the restrooms, right, divided by the color line, everything was, including where you could actually live. And even, given all of that, Black folks were able to build entire communities. They were homeowners in their own communities. They built schools. They built all of these places for health care. They had doctors. They had lawyers. And there were some folks who couldn't stand that. Yeah. The KKK was born out of the Jim Crow era. And they said, no, you cannot have anything. And thus began the Black Massacres. And people only remember Black Wall Street being burned to the ground. But I want you to just pause and take a moment to look at this map. There are these massacres and burning downs of communities all over the nation. Take a look at that. Tulsa was just one of many. These burnings started all the way back in 1866, right after folks were freed. Immediately, as soon as they could build up something, in Memphis, in New Orleans, it was burned down. Again, we don't think about that as massive homelessness, but it was, right? When you have whole families through 1866 all the way through the 1940s having to start over and over and over and over again and never being able to create any kind of wealth and grounding. And then we ask, how did we get to where we are today? This is part of it. 1918 through 1968, okay? We institutionalized housing discrimination. I'm going to talk about how we did that. In 1944, the GI Bill refuses to honor all of those benefits that were due. Veterans, well, they refused to honor those to Black vets. Now, I want to pause there for a moment, because during that time was when the white middle class was built. You know why? Because they were able to buy homes that were subsidized by these United States, by the federal government. Yeah. And then we had the 1960 to the present, mass incarceration. And so think about all of those stacks. So you're incarcerating all of these Black folks, all of these brown folks. So how are you going to come through this and actually buy homes? And we know through the statistics that people were being incarcerated for reasons that other folks were not being incarcerated. So think about this. Just a little diversion here, a little tangent. The 13th Amendment, right? Saying that everybody's free and all, but there was a loophole in it. The loophole was that if you somehow broke the law, right, you could be put back in the conditions of slavery. And so that's how they continued to have the free labor. Check it out, read the 13th Amendment sometime. And so you have all of that, all the way from the 13th Amendment, all the way through the present, this mass incarceration of just this circle going in and out of prisons, out of the carceral system. So when is it that you're going to have an opportunity to begin to build housing, right? And pass that on from generation to generation when all of this is working against you? So people say, well, hold up a minute, wait. Didn't we have the Fair Housing Act? Well, yes, we did in 1968. And it was so weakly enforced as though it weren't even there. Yeah, it was on the books, all right. You're right, it was. But nobody was enforcing it. Let's go a little deeper here. Black folks weren't the only folks that were impacted during this time. Indigenous folks, Native Americans whose land had been taken, whose ancestors had been killed, generations of them were forced to assimilate and go to boarding schools, rendered homeless on their own land. Right? So it wasn't just one group. Right? And then in 68, of course, this Fair Housing Act, at the exact same time that the Fair Housing Act was passed, you had these signs in every neighborhood that was predominantly white. Let me read it out for you. It's a little bit small. This sign read in front of this neighborhood, it said, Negroes, this community could become another ghetto. You owe it to your family to buy in another community. Basically, don't come here. We don't want you here. And understand something, if you come here, we're gonna burn you out. And that's what happened over and over and over again. There are thousands of documented cases of Black folks moving into areas trying to achieve that American dream, right? That American dream that we were all promised. you know, that pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, right? And they were burned out. And those were just the ones that were documented. 1968 through the present, exclusionary zoning. So yeah, we had this, you know, Fair Housing Act on the books. That didn't stop anything. Legal zoning ordinances that forbid non-white people from purchasing and occupying property in heavily populated white residential areas. Y'all, this was legal. Legal. Government entities promoted exclusionary zoning as a measure to maintain high property values for white investment properties. Regulated land use imposed restrictions for residential construction of single-family homes and commercial property, right? And so there were all of these legal things that were not permitting Black folks and brown folks to buy into the American dream to get housing. Yeah. So exclusionary zoning continued to influence this housing segregation by preserving the white neighborhoods, excluding people of color from neighborhoods based on income, impacting social determinants of health, right? Because housing equals health, and also restricting access to economic mobility. Think about this. What is one of the greatest investments that folks will make in a lifetime? Their houses, their homes. Everybody's not going to have a great big business that's going to generate, you know, all of this generational wealth that can be passed on and on. Housing, you can take out that second mortgage to send your children to school, you know, to fix things that you need to buy that car, all of those things. But if your population, if your ancestors, and not so very long ago, were denied that opportunity, how do you begin to create that kind of generational wealth that everyone else had an opportunity to do with housing? So let's keep going, coming forward. Institutionalized housing discrimination. Let's take a look at the racially restricted covenants and redlining. Racially restricted covenants, these were legal contracts imposed on deeds, housing deeds that restricted Black, Indigenous, and people of color the ability to purchase or lease occupied property, legally prevented white property owners from selling to Black, Indigenous, and folks of color. So even if you wanted to sell your house to someone other than a white family, you couldn't, right? Let me just read this for you. Racial restrictions. No property in said addition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. No person other than one of the white or Caucasian race shall be permitted to occupy any property in said addition or portion thereof or building thereon, except a domestic servant actually employed by a person of the white or Caucasian race, where the latter is an occupant of such property. Now, this restriction came right before the restriction on animals. Let that soak in for a moment. The restriction came right before the restrictions on where you could store or have animals on your property. Front page news. Check this out. Racially covenants were ruled unenforceable. They're like, no, we can't do this. We can't do this. So this Shelley versus Kramer, they said, oh, well, we better stop this, right? Too many lawsuits coming against us. It was on the books, yeah, but they didn't enforce it. The practice remained commonplace. And in fact, if you were to take a look at some of your deeds on your housing, check closely. You too might have a racially restricted covenant on your deed right now. Okay. And then, of course, redlining. I want to read this for you. For perhaps the first time, the federal government embraced the discriminatory attitudes of the marketplace. Previously, prejudices were personalized and individualized, right? FHA exhorted, though, segregation and enshrined it as public policy. Let me just read that again. The FHA exhorted segregation and enshrined it as public policy. Whole areas of cities were declared ineligible for loan guarantees. Redlining was not officially outlawed until 1968 by the Fair Housing Act, but by then the damage was done. Think of that. We're talking about the federal government, folks, right? And as though once you put one law into place, everything goes back to be okay. The damage was done. Okay? And so redlining. Happens to be a redlining map, Pontiac, Michigan. These were color-coded maps adopted by the Federal Housing Administration to ensure white investment mortgages. So the areas on the map that are marked green and blue, these were considered great investment areas. Basically, that meant that this is where white folks were living. If an area was deemed yellow for risky or marked red for absolutely not, this is where Black folks and some brown folks were. It was considered too risky, so they would not guarantee a loan there for housing. Take a look at that. Pontiac still look like that today? FHA had an underwriting manual, and it said that loans could not be insured to African Americans. This is what it stated. Incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. This was the underwriting manual that was passed out to every single person working in the loan industry. So as a result, communities of color, of course, are going to experience greater inequalities and inequities across all of these systems. So you see, it wasn't just housing. These things played out in the criminal justice system, economic mobility, education, health, housing, across every spectrum. But it started with housing. Okay. Present day, let's go forward. So today's residential segregation in the North, South, Midwest, and West is not the unintended consequence of individual choices. I'm going to start there again. Today's residential segregation in the North, South, Midwest, West is not the unintended consequence of individual choice and of otherwise well-meaning law or regulation, but of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every metropolitan area in the United States. So it wasn't about folks just waking up one day and saying, well, you know what? I think we're going to just go live over there. You had no choice. It was by design. Housing discrimination continued well after the Fair Housing Act. This is what happens today. We have statistics showing from last year, the end of last year, that Black folks especially, and many Hispanics, are required to provide 24 to 48 hours more notice before viewing houses. They're steered to other communities to lower price homes, not even allowed to go to the open houses in the more affluent areas of any city. They're asked more questions about their qualifications, shown fewer homes, told about fewer listings, quoted higher loan rates, offered fewer discounts on closing costs, thus leading to higher eviction rates. Folks, this wasn't back then. Every single one of these, we have statistics that this was happening to the end of last year. And of course, it's still happening now. We just haven't gathered the statistics for January and February. This wasn't in the past. This is right now. Okay? So all of this, I'm trying to set for you the context of why we have these great inequities in our homelessness system, that Black and brown folks are so disproportionately represented in our homeless system. Landlords and real estate agents refuse to advertise all of their available units in their portfolio, right? When a Black or brown person comes in, all of a sudden, oh, we don't have any vacancies here. We've read over the last year or so appraisers devaluing property values of Black homeowners. So even if you're choosing to leave your particular home and go to another part of the city or another state or even leave the country, you can't even get the value of your home, right? Black properties are typically devalued about $48,000 on average. We've seen cases in the last year of up to $500,000 on the West Coast of devaluing properties for African Americans in their homes. Think about the billions of dollars that are lost every year. Because if you're Black and own a home, it's devalued. Predatory lending practices, right? Folks, this is happening right now. See, all of this is connected to housing inequities. Mass incarceration of folks of color into the criminal justice system, which becomes a cycle into homelessness. It's a revolving door. Crime-free housing ordinances. And so if folks are over-policed and put into jail for things that other folks are not put into jail for, and then you say, well, wait a minute though, if you have any kind of record, you can't get into this apartment, you can't get into this public housing, well then how do you expect people to live? Where are you gonna go to? All that's left is a tent or a shelter, and sometimes the shelters are even closed to you. And then of course we have the deinstitutionalization of people in state mental hospitals. So if you've not been able to buy house and build Westonall, and you didn't have jobs and maybe had the kind of insurance that others had, so where are you going to continue to get treatment? You're going to end up on the street. And then, of course, the huge reductions in federal investments in public housing. So not having even a safety net around housing. You see what you see how it's building here, this context around the inequities? But folks, here's the deal. We can imagine a different future. We can make a difference here. So at the beginning of COVID, there was this wonderful essay. Erin Hottie Roy wrote this essay, and she was speaking specifically about COVID. But I believe that we can use the same thing when we're talking about dismantling structural racism. I believe that we are in a moment of history when we can acknowledge fully our past and begin to heal from that and try to move toward a more equitable future for all of us. I want to read this to you. She said, whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink this doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. You see, nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. You see, it is a portal. It is a gateway between this world and the next. Let's think about that in terms of structural racism. This moment that we have, this racial reckoning, the summer of the uprisings, this pandemic, COVID-19 and racism 20, you know, all of this coming together, of course, the years and the centuries of racism all coming together in these last 2 years in this rupture that has taken place in our country. So let's walk into that. Let's figure out if we can do some things differently. We do not have to continue down this road. We can imagine and we can work toward a different kind of future. And the way that we do that in housing, let's go ahead and name racial equity as a goal. Let's begin to shift from diversity to equity when we're talking about housing, right? Embracing a multi-system approach to ending homelessness. Yes, all of those adjacent systems, we got to bring them together. We've got to conduct racial equity impact analysis on everything that we do when it comes to housing. Who is this policy benefiting? Who is it harming? What are the unintended consequences of this policy, of this housing policy, of this community investment? Who did you leave out? We got to have these equitable outcomes that we're stretching ourselves to meet. We can't just assume that it's going to happen. We got to have some accountability around it, right? We got to make it happen. We've got to align our funding to meet those racial equity goals. Put the money where your mouth is. If you say that we're going to step into this new kind of future around really trying to end homelessness, trying to dismantle structural racism as it plays out in our homelessness systems of housing insecurity, then put the money where your mouth is. Incorporate racial equity into grant making and contracting for homelessness and housing programs. Work with funders and decision makers to align with and match this federal funding. Fund support services at the proportionate level to housing. It is not just housing, it is housing and ensure equity in funding across communities and providers. Okay? All of the same folks should be getting the same monies all the time. Where are all of those grassroots organizations that are doing the real work out in communities, right? All of those small and mom and pop organizations that truly know what's going on in their communities and the housing and services needs. Make sure that they're getting equitable funding. Submit to culturally appropriate support services. How often do you hear people say, especially about folks that are experiencing homelessness, well, you know what, they just don't accept services. You know, they're just not compliant. Did you ever think that your services weren't for them, right? That we need to actually be appropriately, culturally, for our support services? If you keep walking into a place and you never see anyone that looks like you, that can truly see you, that can understand your culture, but you're asked to keep going back and get services from somebody who literally cannot see you, that you've got to keep explaining who you are, you've got to keep explaining your humanity. Why? Why on God's good green earth would you continue with those services? So sometimes it's not about folks not being compliant and taking this service or that service. It's about the service not being the perfect kind of service for them, the appropriate service, the most culturally appropriate service. Okay? Set that expectation for anti-racist program delivery. Yeah. Expand the role of community organizations and those most impacted. If you do not leverage existing community and grassroots organizations, you're not going to end homelessness, nor dismantle all of those structural racist policies. You gotta pull in the grassroots organizations, especially those that are led by and supported by Black and Indigenous and folks of color. And I wanna emphasize this, engage with folks with lived experience of housing insecurity, because see, they can tell you exactly what the system needs to look like. Actually listen and partner with them. Make sure they are at the table when the decisions are being made. Don't come up with this really, really wonderful plan that you think is all great and then ask them to come in for a piece of pizza or a $5 gift card and say, well, what do you think about that? I don't think anything about it, right? I wasn't at the table when it was put together. Make sure that you are engaging Black and brown folks that are experiencing homelessness from can to cane, as we say down south, from the conceptualization of a policy, of a program, all the way to the monitoring of it, right? To see if it's actually working, if folks are actually getting the kind of housing that they're needed and able to thrive. Okay? Expand, of course, the access to affordable housing, right? Increase the deeply affordable housing inventory. I intentionally put this one at number 5 because there's a lot of stuff, because we're queuing, okay, yes, well, of course we've got to have housing, that's of course, but we've got to have housing and everything else. But we must also, of course, focus on deeply affordable housing inventory that is of quality, not just throwing some stuff together, right? And at the same time that we're talking about this deeply affordable housing inventory, we've got to address the transportation barriers, the connectivity barriers, right? Remove those barriers for just as involved people, because then how are you going to actually access that deeply affordable housing? Okay? And we got to change the narrative. It's got to be housing and livable wage employment, well-resourced communities, access to high-quality education, access to affordable housing, quality child care, reliable, widespread public transportation. address the inequities in adjacent systems, upstream, eviction prevention, law enforcement, public safety. We got to get in those systems and make sure that we don't have that same disproportionality of Black and brown folks even coming into the homeless system, right? And then we got to connect hope, faith, and action. You see, hope is needed. It's necessary if we're going to continue to do all these complex and complicated things. It is vital to changing the world, right? And so, and we all know, right, that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Yeah. And so we need to connect hope and faith, and then we need to change that into action, right? If you just think back for a moment, Queen Esther said, yo, we're gonna fast and pray, right? And if I perish, I perish, but I will go into the king because I need to save my people. I need to get some things in action, right? And if I perish, I perish. You see, that's action. The parallel of the Good Samaritan. So see, it's not enough to just notice that folks don't have what they need. Sometimes you're gonna have to cross the street, go in your bag, take out some stuff and help somebody, and then make sure they can sustain it. Because see, the Good Samaritan, he didn't just take the person to the end. I'll pay you to make sure that it's taken care of, you see. Jesus said, wait a minute. He said, disciples, wait, the folks are hungry, right? Wait, so what are we going to do? Of course, he already had a plan. We'll hand those 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus acted, yeah? So he made sure that he fed the multitude, and then he said, pick up all that remains, all the fragments that remain. And so what we have here is that we got to get rid of that scarcity mindset, that belief that there is not enough. You see, because there can be housing for everybody. There can be services for everybody if we move away from that scarcity mindset, if we move away from that mindset that only 1 or 2 folks can have some. See, that little boy had 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? But Jesus said everybody can have some. And in fact, there are going to be some that's going to be left, right? 12 buckets of the fragments that remain. Yeah. And then finally, we have to move beyond best. I know what you learned in school, right? The comparative and superlative, good, better, best. Well, let me add something to you here. They did teach you all of it, because good, better, and best is not enough. That 4th one there is called necessary. But see, sometimes our best isn't good enough. Our best is understanding the problem around structural racism and housing insecurity and housing instability. But necessary is doing all of those action steps that we just talked about. So I would ask you today, are you willing to do what is necessary to dismantle structural racism and housing insecurity? Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague and friend, Kimber.
Regina, that was awesome. Thank you. Hard act to follow. All right, let me see if I can pull up my screen real quick. All right, my name is Kimber Bishop-Yanke. I am the chair of the Oakland County Task Force on Poverty and Homelessness. I also have a small nonprofit called Kids Empowered on the Move and a small business called Kids Empowered. I want to start off by sharing how the task force got started, how I got involved in this work. About 3 years ago, actually around this time exactly, I received a phone call from a friend who was a former teacher, and she said she had a former student who was sleeping in her car. It was during the polar vortex, and this young gal was about 22 years old, and she asked me, could you help her try to find shelter? I go to Kensington Church, Birmingham campus, and for the last 9 years, I have organized our volunteers to volunteer at the warming center that Genesis Church holds every year. Now, the warming center was started over 20 years ago when 2 homeless men froze to death, and somebody at St. Mary's Church said we must do something. And so a group of churches got together and they started offering overnights, dinners, breakfasts for about 10 weeks. That resulted in an organization called the Welcome Inn being created to be the day center. But it's about 12 weeks long, obviously not long enough in Michigan. So that's how I got started. This is a picture of the young girl that I dropped off at Grace Center of Hope. I dropped her off 3 different times because she got kicked out a couple of times. And because of the weather with the polar vortex, she was allowed to come back because it was emergency weather. But in the process of trying to help Sam, I called all of these organizations that were supposed to help people who are homeless. And what I found was we got a lot of voicemails and no return phone calls. We got a lot of calls that said, well, here, call this number. We got emails that had 10 pages of numbers to call. I had 3 friends that opened their homes to her to keep her out of the cold. I was so upset by how Sam was treated and how I was just blown away by the lack of resources in our community. I called Representative Christine Gregg, who at the time, 3 years ago, was the House Minority Leader for the Democrats. And I just said, Chris, we have a problem in Oakland County. We don't seem to have enough resources. And she agreed. She said that this issue had not been addressed in years. And so she invited me to pull together a meeting if she would bring some elected officials. Genesis Church agreed to hold the meeting, and we brought different organizations from the homelessness services with elected officials. At that meeting, Representative Carter stood up and said, I would like to start a caucus on poverty and homelessness in the House, and asked Senator Rosemary Bayer to start one in the Senate. And I would like to start a local task force. And she asked me if I would help. And of course I said yes, because I have a policy that if I'm going to complain about something, I'm going to help with solve the problem. 2 weeks later, I found out I was the chair of the Oakland County Task Force on Poverty and Homelessness. So for 2 years, I started holding meetings where we had different speakers come in. And our mission was to increase awareness about the barriers people in poverty and homelessness face, to identify legislative issues that can be addressed, to remove barriers and create support, and to inspire citizens of Oakland County that we ourselves would help solve this problem. We wouldn't wait for the government, we wouldn't wait for our nonprofits, that we as individuals could be part of the solution. In the process of doing that, one of the people that attended our meetings was Sarah Sanders. She works for Communities and Schools. At the time, she was in Pontiac High School servicing teens. And she shared with me that she was giving kids, high school kids, cans of ravioli to take home because they didn't have enough to eat. She also shared that she was taking their clothes home and doing the wash at her house because they did not have washers and dryers. We were able to access a grant through Eagles for Children, which actually Oakland Hills Country Club is one of the providers of that grant, and as you guys know, burned down today. Sorry. So we got a washer and dryer delivered on the day the school shut down for the pandemic. Sarah also informed me about the food, and I was curious, like, how can this be? We have so many food pantries. But the truth is, the food pantries have very odd hours. So if you're a working person, going to a food pantry during the day is not feasible. If you don't have a car, is not feasible. So I decided that we would try a small food delivery. of fresh fruits and vegetables to 25 families that did not have transportation. Little did I know, March 21st of 2020 was the date we had planned. Little did I know that was going to be, we were going to be in the midst of the pandemic. 2 weeks before we were supposed to do the delivery, we found out the schools were shutting down. I had partnered with Micah 6 in Pontiac, which is a fabulous organization if you want to find an organization to get involved in. And I said to Coleman, the founder, let's just do as many families as we can and as much food as we can. And we ran it through Representative Carter. She let us use her office. We had 50 drivers, and we delivered 250 to 250 families a few weeks of food. From that, we then found out that a professor at Oakland University was trying to bring all the food banks under one roof to make sure that there was little contact and that everybody got served. So we approached Jennifer Lucarelli and said, we would like to join your efforts and deliver food on Saturdays. We already have 50 volunteers. We already have the families. And 2 weeks later, we started delivering every Saturday, and we are still delivering food every Saturday for almost 2 years now. What happened is our volunteers, once they started delivering food, they started getting to know the families. And the first phone call came from a volunteer that said, Kimber, I just delivered food to a single mom with a 6th grader and an 8-month-old baby. The baby's sleeping in a dresser drawer. Do you think we could get a crib? And I was like, I'm sure we could find a crib. Within 3 days, the volunteer was back building the crib for the family. And that started furniture delivery. Furniture Bank, Humble Design, all the nonprofits had shut down because of the pandemic. But our volunteers actually stepped up, and pretty much every week of the first year, we were delivering beds to children, couches, you name it. So out of that, what happened is a year into it, I was raising all kinds of funds to pay for the food, pay for furniture, pay for transportation, homelessness. There was an organization called Band of Brothers that was collecting these donations for me. And they said, Kimber, we had no idea this was going to go on for this long. And so they asked me to find another organization to accept donations. And I joined an organization called Abide, which has a number of ministries to serve people. And then I actually activated a nonprofit that I had for 20 years. Called Kids Empowered on the Move. And we are doing things like Easter baskets, which we have going on right now. We're raising money. For 2 years, we've provided an Easter meal. So we're raising money to provide an Easter meal again for 150 families. We have raised money to buy 4 mobile homes. There is no housing available, so we have had to resort to buying something. We have a Christmas program, and we're paying for several families in hotels. Additionally, we have a book buddy program, and because it's Black History Month, we are working on right now providing 100 children with an opportunity to hear the author Don Tate read his book about a poet, and we're providing all the children with blankets. I think all of us would be appalled if we found out how many children a few miles down the road have no beds. About 3 weeks ago, one of our volunteers, Evelyn, who every week is delivering food, delivering furniture, put together 4 beds that you see in this picture. And one of the children was sleeping on a pool float. We provided handmade desks to children right when the pandemic started. I play soccer. A bunch of my soccer friends built about 50 handmade desks to deliver to children. And that was quite fun. So let's talk about some of the situations in Oakland County. I just want to let you know how challenging it is for people who are in crisis to get help. So one of the gentlemen that we are helping right now, about 5 weeks ago, I got a phone call, or actually an email, saying there was an elderly gentleman on oxygen standing in Pontiac in the cold, and he was homeless. Could I do anything? I called a shelter. I was able to secure a spot for him, and I connected the folks together, and I thought it all worked out. And he had to go get a COVID test, and it turned out he had COVID. I don't know what happened with his spot at the shelter. I got a text Friday night at 6 o'clock saying that he was going to get kicked out of the place he'd been staying for the last few days. Could I help him? So I called him up. He informed me he had COVID, so I did not want to get him an Uber and send him to a hotel. So I asked him if I could speak to the person who at the house he was staying at. He was staying at a boarding house. And basically she agreed, if I sent her money, she agreed to let him stay there 4 or 5 more days. And then he was able to get into a hotel, and SERA funds, which is the federal government funds for people who are homeless, came through. But every week he has to prove that he is looking for housing. And so here's the problem. He has no car, no transportation. He uses a walker, has an oxygen tank. He has no computer to do the applications on, or printer to print them out. He doesn't have money to pay for the application fees, which could be up to $150 a week. And I just want to show you a few. This is one of the lists that he was sent by someone at one of the nonprofits to call. So many of these lists that the same people get, we already know they have a year to a year and a half waiting list. Some of them are wrong numbers, but all of the homeless people get the same list. And it's very frustrating that there are wrong numbers and that homeless people are being asked to call places that there's a 2-year waiting list. Like why ask them to do that? So we are helping him try to find a place to live. Okay, so part of the problem that we have is that Michigan has a Home Rule City Act, meaning that every single city, town gets to decide its own policies, that we cannot, as Michigan, have a universal policy. So that's part of the problem, because nobody wants a shelter in their community, nobody wants affordable housing in their community. And what has happened is that in Oakland County, all the communities have sort of pushed all the problems onto Pontiac. Another piece of the problem is the HUD definition of homelessness. If you are an adult, you must be living in your car, on the street, in a shelter, or a hotel paid for by a shelter to be considered homeless. So before the pandemic, I got a call from Pontiac Schools with a mom. Actually, this was during the pandemic because this mom had COVID. She had 6 children, 3 of the children had COVID. And I called one of the homeless organizations and said, I will raise the money and give it to you so that she can be considered homeless because you'll pay for her hotel instead of me paying for her hotel, which makes her no longer homeless. I did not get a call back. But that's part of the problem. So if a church or an individual or a nonprofit that's not in the homelessness world wants to pay for somebody who is homeless in a hotel, that person cannot receive the funding that is geared for people who are homeless. The other thing wrong with this definition is that it basically forces people into complete despair, because when you go into homelessness, that means you haven't made your car payments, your car insurance payments, your phone payment. You are hitting rock bottom instead of trying to catch them before they spiral out of control. Students, we have about 3,200 students who are considered homeless in Oakland County. Now, the definition for students is different. It means that you are either sleeping in a shelter, a hotel, on the streets, in a car, or you can be doubled up in somebody's home. Now, the good news about this, which is still really sad, is about 70% of our children are doubled up that are considered homeless. They are doubled up in somebody else's home. But it's unstable. It's not a good learning environment for them. They're still housing insecure. They're still food insecure. We have roughly about 3,000 folks that are homeless in Oakland County, and we have roughly 172 beds for people who are homeless. So it is clear that Oakland County does not have the resources. Hope Shelter has 62 beds, and that is the adult shelter in Oakland County. We do not have a family shelter in Oakland County. Some of you all may remember that Oakland County received a letter in 2018 from HUD that the housing policies were discriminatory. That they were geared, the funding that HUD had given was going towards people who were white. So it's very clear that Oakland County has a long history of policies that do not benefit our brown and Black families. So inadequate housing is a root cause of poverty. Housing is considered affordable if housing costs do not exceed 30% of a household's income. An estimated 12 million renters and homeowners across the country pay more than half of their annual income for housing. Nationwide, we have a 7.2 million unit shortage in affordable housing. Oakland County has a need of about 11,582 units for workers. We have a shortage of 16,000 housing units that are affordable to the bottom 20% of income earners. We have a shortage of 21,000 affordable housing units for the bottom 40% of income units. People of color represent 14% of our county's population, but they represent 68% of our homeless population. 150,000 renters in Oakland County are 41.4 cost burden, paying more than the 30% of income in rent. The average wait for a housing choice voucher in Oakland County is 26 months. A worker in Oakland County who earns the minimum wage of $9.65 per hour would need to work 65 hours per week in order just to afford a 2-bedroom rental home at fair market rate. And I just want to say the other thing about Pontiac is that I was told somewhere between like 70 to 80% of all houses have landlords. People do not own homes in Pontiac. The majority of people do not own homes. And that is part of the problem. Okay, just to share a little bit about evictions. This information is from Lakeshore Legal Aid, which is a fabulous organization in Oakland County. So this shows how many people get evicted each year statewide. And then you can see the slide below it shows how many people get evicted in Oakland County. And what is really distressing is that 92% of the evictions are because of non-payment, but only for $1,100 in back rent. So 92% of people are getting evicted for $1,100 in back rent. You would think that we would have a program to prevent this. And look statistically, compared to nationwide, Southfield has a rate of 32.8%, Pontiac 31.2%, Oak Park 26.8%, compared to Chicago 3.9, Philadelphia 7.8, Cincinnati 8.7. So we have some of the highest eviction rates in the country. And who is getting evicted? Our Black and brown neighbors, especially mothers with children. And this starts a whole spiral of other problems. Leads to increased poverty, job loss, increased health problems, chronic school absence, behavioral issues, foster care, 19% because of inadequate housing. Families have to move to neighborhoods with higher crime rates, and they have to move to housing with no heat, repair issues, exposed wires, broken appliances. And let me tell you, we have worked with a number of families that are in housing run by Section 8, where landlords are not repairing the things that need to be repaired. One Friday night, I received a text at 10 p.m. A mom and 2 children were being evicted on the spot by the police because the smoke alarm was going off. The police showed up, and what they found was a refrigerator that did not work, an oven that did not work, and mattresses on the floor, clothing on the floor, no dressers. They had a lot of cats, so pee all over the clothing. And so the children and mom had to leave the house. The house was deemed unlivable and eventually torn down. But this particular mom had to live in a hotel for about 8 months. I'm happy to say she is in a house now, and our volunteers filled her house with furniture, clothing, food, and one of our volunteers that delivered furniture to her has been every week goes and tutors one of her children, has gotten the mom into a GED program, and every week delivers food. So that is part of our hope, is that when my COVID response started, when COVID response started and we became part of the food delivery program, my COVID response connected people in need with volunteers who are willing to help. And what has happened is some of the most beautiful relationships have been formed. So we have everyday people like ourselves that are developing relationships with people in need directly and are supporting those families. And to me, that is the most beautiful thing that has happened out of the pandemic. Just a few miles away from one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Michigan, which I'm part of, and many of you are part of, we have a lot of poverty. We have Pontiac, where the unemployment rate is 13.3%, 9th worst in Michigan. We have a high rate of violent crime, 8th 8th most violent crimes anywhere in the state. Another thing is that there's a lack of grocery stores and ability to get healthy food. And that's something that Micah 6 is trying to help with. One of the things that I learned serving people the last 3 years is that we have a lot of Hispanic families. And we have a lot of families that ICE has deported the dad and left the mom with many children to take care of. And some of the struggles that our Hispanic families have are language barriers, the fear of deportation. They have legal stresses, educational factors, and some of them can't get jobs because we are lacking in our country a great immigration system. So what is being done? Well, the good news is that we now have an executive director of Oakland County who is committed to helping people in poverty. We have some commissioners that are also committed. Charlie Cavell, he's leading the initiative with Dave Woodward, who is the chair of the Oakland County Commissioners. They have passed the source of income discrimination. But again, because Michigan has the home rule, every single community has to vote to pass this. And so far, only Ferndale, Hazel Park, Madison Heights, and Oak Park has passed this. I doubt that Birmingham, the community I live in, will ever pass it. It's disappointing. They've also created a fund called the Landlord Mitigation Fund. There is prejudice that people who are on Section 8 or housing vouchers do destroy their houses, apartments. So what, and that's false. But what has happened is Oakland County is setting up a landlord mitigation fund. So if you're a landlord and you rent to somebody who is on Section 8 and they do damage, you can get some funding to make those repairs. On March 10th, we are hoping that the county commissioners will pass the Oakland Together Attainable Housing Trust Fund. So through the American Rescue Plan Act, Oakland County has received quite a bit of funding. And the commissioners are deciding now what to do with that funding. So if there is one thing that everybody would like to do to help, you can reach out to your county commissioner to tell them you would like this to pass. And I would like to even say more of that funding should be geared towards the resources that we're lacking. But they're looking at creating a shelter capacity fund. And the good news is they're gonna create smaller shelters. Being in a shelter is not an ideal environment for anybody. And if you're talking about a person that is in crisis, it is not a good environment. So people need their own space to feel safe. To be in a room with 60 other people is very stressful. They're creating some money to go towards the roofs, ramps, and repairs program to try to help some of the rundown houses. And then they're hoping to create, looking at zoning policies and processes. So what can we each do? We can be more aware and help create awareness with others. I have found that the more people understand that people in poverty are not lazy, just like everybody else, whether you're rich or poor, there are some lazy people, but just like everybody else, there are definitely hard workers. We need to vote for politicians who will support these programs. We need to understand the nonprofits that are doing the work. Just because somebody has a glossy brochure that says they're doing the work doesn't necessarily mean that they're really doing the hands-on work a person needs. So I really encourage everybody to investigate the nonprofits that they're donating to, and to look for those small nonprofits that are on the ground, their feet on the ground. You could adopt a family in need. The more that you develop relationships with our neighbors and understand their needs, the more that we win as a community, and we can support Pontiac businesses. And on that note, I thank you all for listening, and I guess we'll take questions. Janet, are you taking it over?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. You gave us an awful lot of information to think about. Okay, so let's start with questions. We had one question. Question that came in about incarceration, and I know Regina answered it in the thing, but let's go over it anyhow. Said, if a person has been incarcerated, could they then get a home loan? Regina, could you expand on that, what you said?
Yeah, certainly. Most banks now perceive that as being too risky, and so they'll immediately say no. Sometimes it depends on the number of years since they have been incarcerated. But if they do say yes, they have to get like an extensive co-signers, who have impeccable, credit and everything. So it's a hard battle once you have that record to actually go in and get a loan, for a home.
And it's even hard to get to find rental that'll take you, right? You can be.
That's exactly right. And the private landlords can put any kind of restrictions that they want on it. And what we have to be careful of is that public housing authorities, there are only two things that they're supposed to say no to, but they add all of their own, to that. So you can only say no to, like, if someone was found actually making meth, if it was for arson, or if it was a sex crime that you're actually on a lifetime ban. But the public housing authorities, they have like one this high, like they just have rows and rows of things that screen people out. And so that's public federal dollars, and they're not allowing people to live there.
It sounds like there's just not a whole lot of places for those folks to go at all. Okay. Other questions, folks? Let me look in the chat real quick here to see if any in the. Okay, so we don't have any in the chat. So Regina, on a national level, what kind of, Kimber gave us a lot of great examples in our own area of programs and how we can make an impact. What do you see as being the most successful types of, most impactful things that individuals can do to correct these situations or to help?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, obviously to give, if you don't have funds, but you can give of your time. And that time is not just going to the shelters or, passing out food and all. It's around advocacy and policy work. Kimber mentioned earlier that the ARPA funds, the American Rescue Act funds, you have to show up at those meetings, because believe me, other constituencies are. And so when those, hundreds of millions of dollars that are coming through the state and counties, you look up and it's gone. And so there may be some housing being developed, but not quality and deeply affordable housing. So even standing up for that. The other thing is working alongside philanthropy and convincing them to be bridge funding to start building affordable housing. And the way that acts, there's some really wonderful examples. I was just out in Santa Clara County, and they have what they call fast build housing, and it's manufactured. And so they have found a plot of land to actually where people are getting jobs to actually build the manufactured housing and then putting them in plots for people to live. And it's like a third of what building a unit would cost. And what they did was that the philanthropy in the community bridged that. So you know what, you're a little bit slow, federal government, but we know you're coming. So we're gonna bridge the money in the beginning. So those are a few things that can be done.
Those are fantastic suggestions. Kimber, what do you see as being really the most effective? Is it when folks really adopt a family? Is that what makes the most change?
Well, I think that, I mean, part of our issue in Oakland County is that everybody doesn't want it in their backyard. So, you know, we do actually have different organizations that want to build affordable housing, but the problem is the communities don't want it in their backyard. And so I think that we have to go out and rally the troops and say, like, this is a community, like everybody in Oakland County needs to take some responsibility. And could we give big incentives? Like, I was talking to Charlie Cavell, and I, you know, they're gonna say that we're gonna give, you know, we're gonna give money to builders, you know, if 4 units out of the 20 units is affordable housing. But I think we really need to give some big dollar incentives to really build a community that has a good grocery store. So our families are not having to go to the convenience stores to get food. And talk about that, like our volunteers that deliver food, they will often pick up items that the families need. And they want to know ahead of times, because they were like, Kimber, we don't want to shop at those stores in Pontiac because they charge their higher prices. So I think that as a community, we need to let our commissioners know, our elected officials know, that we want to act as a community to solve this problem, that we don't want to just keep dumping on Pontiac and Oak Park to handle the problem. But I think as individuals, I think adopting a family gives you the opportunity to learn and grow and become impact, you know, people's lives directly. And there's nothing better than that, is to have that kind of direct impact.
Excellent, good. Let's see, do we have any other questions? I don't see any other open questions. Oh, okay, so I see a couple of comments on, one is on the Cass Community Social Services and the tiny homes that they've made, that we've heard of over the years. Is there any kind of community or anything brewing like that in Oakland County that you've heard of?
Even in Pontiac, they rejected tiny homes. Would love to see a community like that. We had, I would also love to invite everyone to join our monthly Oakland Task Force meeting, because we have different speakers coming in. And again, the more that everyday people show that we're interested in this subject and we care about it, then we're going to bring this issue to the forefront, and the elected officials who can do something will be inspired to do something. But yeah, we brought the creator of the tiny home project at Cass Quarter. She's fabulous, amazing, and would love to have a project like that in Oakland County that we could get behind.
Kimber, is there, maybe you can put in the chat a link to the task force? And is there, you know, a lot of folks in the church community there don't have the availability to come during the day to the meetings? Is there a way that they can access the information at other times? You know, just look for the recordings or whatever. Is it on a website?
Yeah, so the task force really is, has really no structure behind it. So we don't have a website or anything like that. We kind of fly by the seat of our pants. But if people give me their emails, they'll receive the Evite, and then every month after the meeting, I try to send out the PowerPoint and the recorded video of the meeting. So would love to have more people to spread the word. I'll put that in the chat.
Thank you very much. Do folks have other some other comments or questions? what else we've gotten here. All right. I don't see any other questions. Oh, there's another one. But okay, so with that, I guess we'll wrap up here. Thank you again, Kimber and Regina. We really appreciate all of your information. Your thoroughness can be seen by not having as many questions because you really have given us so much to think about, and a lot of actionable things to do, I would say. So that's very, very, very helpful. And that this is great support to our Matthew 25 vision, to give us a lot to think about, to open our eyes to what's going on right here in our own community and the reasons for it. So we thank you very much for that. So for everyone online, please remember that we have our Learn Toolkit that's online for you to dive deeper into this topic. There are books there. There's other media related to structural racism. We will, under the Listen tab, we will have this recording of this so you can listen to it again, or you can share it with folks so that they can listen to it if they missed it. We've also added additionally some new content, and we'll be adding more in preparation for our final speaker, who will be Mary Mabaya, who's the Vice President, Diversity and Inclusion Director at Flagstar Bank. And she will speak about the racial wealth gap on March 24th. So again, we will have our next Zoom Lean In session on March 3rd, at which we can discuss racism and housing in a small group setting. I think Kimber and Regina have given us an awful lot to think about here. So that should be a good discussion. I can say that I look forward to these Lean In sessions, because we really learn and grow by listening to each other and sharing what we've lived and learned. Folks from all walks of life and many different organizations join us to share their truths and their successes in dismantling structural racism. So all are welcome to those that wish to be a part of the change. Please register for that event through the Lean In button on our website. And then just to give you an idea of where we're going after that, at the end of April, we plan to have a capstone Lean In event to bring together all of the ideas that we've had to date and speak about actions that we would like to pursue together. Hopefully have some kind of a meetup when weather gets better and we can maybe meet up under the tent. And in June, we will launch our Lean In Media Group with a discussion, with a book discussion focused on Juneteenth. So thank you all for attending this Listen event. Good night, and please have a safe moment.